Welcome to Believing the Real, a series of talks on the theology of the real. And in this episode of Believing the Real, Evotrust, Chapter 7, we will discuss the shift in evolution from biology to mind and the role of religion and God in the evolution of humankind. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Believing the Real. In this episode, I hope to wrap up our survey of biological evolution as the pre-wiring for our present state of affairs. Of course, what is of major interest for us is to understand what's happening in our current age in modernity, or people define it late modernity. I call it the age of doubt. So in this age of doubt, this place where we are now, which we can conceive of in the within the meta theory that we presented here about believing the real. Let's switch to my slide that shows this. Okay, so we have the ideals or the beliefs of our society, of our civilization, and we have the real. And if we go by Popperian terminology, this is conjectures and refutations, as it were. And we live in the age of doubt, in the age of refutations, where every conjecture or every ideal is taken with a grain of salt, because we're not sure about where the truth actually lies. The great experiments of the 20th century in social engineering seems to have failed miserably. Communism, Nazism, fascism, the Gang of Four, terrible consequences for really tremendous social experiments that seem to have taken all the worst of humanity and brought it to the forefront, where the intention was in fact to bring about a better world. So this is really something that we have to understand why it happened, how it could have happened. So we will turn to modernity eventually, perhaps after this current episode, or maybe the next episode. But in any case, in this episode, we are going to continue with Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, and use that as a text that will help us understand the face of evolutionary progress, and especially the particular shifts that occurred in the emergence of humanity that pre-wire us for our current positions, provide us with the biological substructures that are impacting our decisions, our destiny, as it were, our vocation, which is the choices that we make, our voluntary decisions about how we are going to live out our lives within the real. And we are using the insights about evolution that Haidt provides to see where we are at the moment. And we've already seen in the last talk how for example, the tendency to have an alpha male and obey that alpha male is in fact an evolutionary throwback for humanity, which outgrew this tendency when it became tribal, when it became social. Because if we look at the most ancient human types of society, the hunter-gatherers, we find that they are quite egalitarian. So from egalitarianism, we went on to a sort of reversion, an atavistic reversion to the bullying mode of dominance, of controlling and ruling society. And in our times, we are going back to our true human heritage, as it were, of egalitarianism, which is based on mind, on the ideal pole of our existence. If we have the ideal and the real, as you see here on my, is it right or left here? In the image, it's on the left, so okay. So you see the ideal and the real, conjectures, refutations. So in fact, our ability to constitute ideals, to constitute theories about reality are what makes us human. And in fact, we saw that it is our mental representation of what we and others think of that allows us, in fact, to control reality, to dominate reality, and build ourselves as human beings within the wider range of an extended I, as it were, a sort of multi-man or multi-men, multi-humanity. I don't know how to, I have to find a term to describe this social context, which is in fact like a greater I, where the individual is part of society and shares with others this image of reality through language, through common practice, through religion, and so on, so that each person, although he or she retain their individuality, is in fact embedded within a social fabric that is a product of the mind. So, so obviously this is the way humans do things, and everything that preceded that in evolution, as we summarized it as predation, procreation, parenting, and then finally primate socializing, all this is just the pre-wiring, the biological infrastructure on which the human appeared, and the human takes it to a completely different level. It does everything that was done before in a completely different way. Everything, and we will look at a future talk about each one of these things, predation, procreation, parenting, and socializing, when they come to be within human society, they are different. For how can one compare the human culinary arts and the tremendous food chains and the sharing of production in human civilization with simple predation, like a lion chasing a zebra, or one creature devouring a rabbit eating a carrot, one creature eating another. So this is incomparable. Procreation in the animals, in the animal world, the primate world, is so much, it depends on estrus, depends on so much, depends on biological infrastructures, while in humanity it has been completely transformed and is also a thing of the mind. Procreation itself, the loss of estrus, the loss of pheromones, and of course the evolution of sexuality in human beings, the variety of it, the craziness of it, and especially what's happening today, that it's completely dissociated from procreation itself now. Sexuality and procreation become two different arenas. So it's all this is happening, and it's part of being human that it's all become represented in the mind. And the mind is always a social mind because it is mediated by language, by ideas developed by other people. No man is an island in that sense, that no person can really be the person that they can be without being fully embedded in a human environment, in a human medium. So all these developments are contingent, in fact, on our ability to conceive of ideals, to conceive of great ideas, to conceive of a theory of reality, whether animistic or magical or religious or idolatry or monotheistic and so on. And these very lectures are another attempt at a more sophisticated conception of the ideal and its interaction with the real, but it's all in our representations of the mind. And this is what we do as people, as human beings, and this is how, in fact, we evolve. We evolve within the arena of the mind. In this interaction of between conjectures and refutations, between our ideals, our beliefs, our great religions, our great dogmas, and the ultimate encounter with reality, which either refutes or confirms for a while what we thought about the world. There's a lot to say about the interfaces there. From this, we continue to emerge as human beings within the greater whole of a humanity that constitutes us, that in fact becomes our pre-wiring, not a biological one, but rather a civilizational one. All right, so this is what we're aiming for. This is the direction that we are moving in, and we will just wrap up the insights that we can gain from Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind here about evolution as the pre-wiring for where we are in this arena of the mind, which is the true arena of humanity, and see how, as humans, we replicate various strands of our biological evolution on a completely different level. As we saw, the alpha male is a reinvention of the alpha male. It's not the same alpha male, but because we have the biological heritage of an alpha male, then we are capable of, in the arena of the mind, falling into that trap of placing a dictator on our heads and following him or her blindly. Were there dictatoresses? Maybe Catherine the Great. I don't remember. So yeah, probably it's just Elizabeth R. So it's like it's the structural. It's not gender based. It's the structure. You don't need an alpha male to be an alpha male. You just need the proper position at the top of the pyramid, of a social pyramid so constructed through the beliefs of people in the divinity of sovereignty, in the given right, the birthright, and so on. All these ideals, conjectures, provide the position for an alpha position, a dictator, regardless of gender. So, okay. So going back to Haidt, just to reframe this, we are looking at Haidt's analysis of evolution to see the underpinnings of our evolutionary background, because we are in fact talking about the way that we are detaching ourselves from evolution and reinventing ourselves in a way that replicates certain evolutionary tendencies, certain evolutionary pre-wirings on a completely different level. So as we spoke about the alpha male, there are other things in human existence, or as we said about the procreation or the predation. Everything changes when you get into the human sphere. So this will help us, though, see the trend, the path as it sort of opens out from the narrow path of evolutionary progress, or not really narrow, because in evolution itself we saw, for example, the shift from single cellular to multicellular, but this path that constantly in fact expands and opens up into more free will, more human input about the way that things are going, to the extent of our command of our world at this stage of history, but also a growing respect for the other, a growing sense of the other, to the extent that we have an inner representation of what the other is within us. This is the basis of our empathy, of our intuition, of our ability to interact with others. Love thy neighbor as thyself is not just an external slogan of the interaction between external objects, but it's our ability to actually love, to actually represent our neighbor within ourselves, and ourselves within our neighbor, to find our mutual humanity within ourselves and within all those that we are intersubjectively embedded with, because in our minds the other is like us and we are within the other, and the language that unites us and our worldview that unites us and everything, the practices that unite us. In fact, we are feeling all the time the way that we are like unto others. And then we have to see who is not our neighbor. And then we find all kinds of essentialist theories which were products of our evolutionary development, but we are now trying to get rid of them as baggage that is barring us, that is obstructing us from proceeding, from expanding our ability to actually love, to actually envelop others in our representation of reality, in our ideal, so that all of humanity can continue with its progress, and each human being can manifest his or her full potential as an expression of the divine, the expression of the divine perfecting itself. For we are the epitome of that thrust of evolution. Evolution itself, the world itself, the cosmos itself, is the divine perfecting itself, becoming more and more perfect, progressing towards the ultimate infinite perfection that is forever inconceivable. And we are at the forefront of that. We are the developing bud, the growing, the green growing thrust of evolution, the tip of it, that are ever seeking a better world. And in making a better world, we are creating greater and greater perfection. And it's all in the mind. In the sense, not in the sense of illusion, but in the sense that our minds construct the world. And our minds are able to create a new arena for evolution in a way that replicates the old mode of doing things in a completely different level. Again, just as multicellular creatures replicated everything that unicellular creatures did, but on a completely different level, creating a completely different world with completely different beings, multicellular beings, the world of animals, plants, and so on. So we are now at this juncture of history that we are breaking away from the roots, from our evolutionary roots, from our evolutionary pre-wiring, and creating a whole new destiny, a whole new vista for human life that replicates everything that went before, but in the arena of the civilization, of the culture, of the mind. And when I say mind, not the singular mind, the mind of humanity, the mind of civilization, with all the many, many layers and levels of knowledge, understanding, emotionality, traditions, whatever, everything that civilization has, everything that humanity has is now available to each individual, growing within this sphere. This is our evolutionary sphere, the arena of all the conjectures, from scientific theories to the most dogmatic of religions, that constitute the sphere in which we as human beings live and develop and grow. So yeah, okay, this was just the intro to going back to taking some insight from height, but this gives the framework of where we're aiming, because we're now going more into specifics and looking through height at some of the highlights of our evolution as humans. Okay, so let's take a look at the evolutionary underpinnings of religion, of faith. In fact, of the ideal pole of our range, which range, it's not a range, it's actually the two ways of looking at, because the conjectures and the refutations are both within the real actually, but the ideal pole of our vision. And this discusses some ideas about the evolution of belief, of faith. So of course most evolutionary thinkers, especially the new atheists, view the idea of God, of the divine, as a byproduct rather than something inherent within the way that humans structure reality. And indeed, God is a good idea, and we see that it develops over time, and humans have different gods that evolve over time. So whether we think of it as a byproduct like the new atheists do, or as something inherent within the evolutionary process as a revelation of the perfecting of the divine, the ever-evolving divinity within the divine that is our world, cosmos. So within that we see also an evolution of the way that we believe God behaves or God interacts with us. And this is important because in fact we can say that these very series of talks are also part of that evolution. For what I'm presenting here to you is the evolution of belief, of thought about the divine over many thousands of years. And in particular, as I said in the introductory or the first talks actually, it takes a lot from the ideas of Rabbi Kook, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook, who presented a sophisticated new take of Kabbalah under the influence of Nietzsche, of all philosophers, and other influences. But basically he reinterpreted Kabbalah and gave rise to this basic view that we are using here as a meta theory, the view of progress and perfection, of the cosmos being the developing dynamic aspect of the divine, which in its ultimate perfection cannot be static, but also has to have biologic. This is very rational. It's a very rational belief. The divine biologic, since it is perfect, must also have the perfection of becoming increasingly perfect, which is progress. So this was the reason that the world was created. Why was the Big Bang initiated? Or why was it come about? Why did it come about? Because the divine cannot cannot be lacking in this aspect of becoming better and better, higher and higher all the time. So this is the raison d'être, this is the reason for our existence, to become better, to improve ourselves, to grow, to expand, to develop, to progress, etc., etc. So this is the very basis. So now we look at evolution, and we're going to take the descriptions that we find there and bring them into our perspective, into our ideal or conjecture about God and the cosmos and so on, just that we just stated, and we will see how this goes together, how our evolutionary underpinnings of evolutionary pre-wiring as regards our social heritage also impinges on our visions of God and vice versa. So we imagine a God that actually helps us configure our society or the way we live within it. Okay, so enough introductions. Let's read in Height, the Righteous Mind. It's on page 155, what I'm going to read to you now. Among the best thing to do with a byproduct God, byproduct according to the visions of these evolutionary scholars, according to Atran and Heinrich, is to create a moral community. So, in fact, they're turning it around now. They're saying, okay, a God was imagined, but this helped create a moral community. And this is very true. Religion is very strong at creating moral communities. And this is one of the claims of most religious streams today when facing postmodernity, saying, look, we're breaking apart, go back to religion. That was the way morality was well done, well structured, and so on. Of course it was, but it also had a lot of baggage, such as gender discrimination and so on, that we don't want. So we have to evolve a new vision of the divine, a new God that will help us in our new society. So, and in fact, these series of lectures constitute an attempt to offer this new God as a better representation of the divine that is more conducive to our existence in modernity. Anyway, back to Jonathan Haidt. I'm reading the sentence again. Among the best thing to do with a byproduct God, according to Atran and Heinrich, is to create a moral community. The gods of hunter-gatherers are often capricious and malevolent. They sometimes punish bad behavior, but they bring suffering to the virtuous as well. Of course, we know the Roman gods, the Greek gods, they're all there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on. The great arbitrariness of tragedy. The gods are capricious, and so on. This is the really the essence of what we call, from a monotheistic point of view, call idolatry. Okay, but Hinduism has it. All the gods, all the old pantheons, Norse pantheons, all the pantheons, not just hunter-gatherers, but the pantheons of non-monotheistic people are full of this capriciousness of gods that are very much like people in a sense, and not so godly. Anyway, back to Height. They sometimes punish bad behavior, but they bring suffering to the virtuous as well. As groups take up agriculture and grow larger, however, their gods become far more moralistic. So this ties our evolutionary development into greater, larger societies with our idealistic development as we began to think of the divine in a different way. The gods of larger societies are usually quite concerned about actions and that foment conflict and division within the group, such as murder, adultery, false witness, and the breaking of oath. And also, if we add from the Jewish heritage of the three great don'ts, it's adultery, murder, and idolatry, worshipping gods that are not the present God. So it's like tightening the grip of the God. Indeed, the whole idea of the monotheistic God that sprung for Judaism is a God that is always there, always within, and substitutes for any other external type of morality or even from nature. Nothing is greater than God. Okay, I'm again leaping from here and there, either and either. So let's go back to reading from the text. If the gods evolve culturally to condemn selfish and divisive behavior, they can then be used to promote cooperation and trust within the group. You don't need a social scientist to tell you that people behave less ethically when they think nobody can see them. This was Glaucon's point about the ring of Gyges. This is some parable that he brought before about people acting selfishly and not out of an inner morality, but out of lest people see them. Indeed, many religions have this idea. When the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked him, Rabbi, tell us on his deathbed, tell us what is the most important thing, and he says, may you fear God as much as you fear people. And they said, what? And he said, yes, because when people make transgress and sin, they do not fear God, but they fear being seen by other people. So in fact, and all of the East Chinese civilization is based on all the cultures that emphasize shame rather than guilt. They speak a lot about this of okay, just don't get caught. So there is a kind of externality in human behavior. Our society, our vision of others, and the way that we are embedded within society actually forces us externally to behave morally. And few and far between are those of the righteous who behave morally because of their own inner ethics. And of course, after Foucault, they too have been completely demolished because he took whatever morality you think you have and said, okay, this is also, you have just internalized the external vision. It's not real morality. So, okay, I don't think he's got the point there, but we will have a specific talk about Foucault in future. But in any case, the idea is here that we have a conception, an ideal of the divine that is evolving and that has social implications for good behavior, for behaving as a team player within society. So I continue now with Haidt. He writes, for example, people cheat more on a test when the lights are dimmed. They cheat less when there is a cartoon-like image of an eye nearby. When the concept of God is activated in memory merely by asking people to unscramble sentences that include words related to God. Creating gods who can see everything and who hate cheaters and oath breakers turns out to be a good way to reduce cheating and oath breaking. Of course, you don't really need a god for that, because we have the concept of karma, for example, which talks about the mechanism of just desserts without a god. Because the gods in the Hindu and Buddhist systems are incorporated within the world. You can become a god in your next reincarnation, or a god can go down to a human being in the next reincarnation, all depending on your obedience to the laws of karma. If you behaved justly, if you behaved properly and morally, then your karma will bring you to a better incarnation, and vice versa. So there are many ways of conceiving about a retribution outside of the world, otherworldly retribution, and not just the divines. You can have a god, like the ultimate alpha male, who will give retribution, and that keeps people in order. Or you can have the law of karma that gives retribution regardless of a god and still keeps people behaving according to their moral ideas or moral ideals. And ordering society. So, okay, that was a quote from page 155. Now I'm reading another quote from page 156. It continues. Okay, so I'm going to read some more of this to you. Begin quotation. Another helpful cultural innovation, according to Atron and Heinrich, are gods who administer collective punishment. When people believe that gods might bring drought or pestilence on the whole village for the adultery of two people, you can bet that the villagers will be much more vigilant for and gossipy about any hint of an extramarital liaison. Any angry gods make shame more effective as a means of social control. Atran and Heinrich begin with the same claim about the byproducts as do the new atheists, but because these anthropologists see groups as real entities that have long been in competition, they are able to see the role that religion plays in helping some groups to win that competition. There is now a great deal of evidence that religions do in fact help groups to cohere, solve free rider problems, and win the competition for group level survival. The clearest evidence comes from the anthropologist Richard Sosis, who examined the history of 200 communes founded in the United States in the 19th century. This is really interesting. It's like a mini laboratory of examining religions. There was this great flowering in the 19th century America of new religions, sects, creeds, ideas. They were really creating the divine, recreating the divine. Amazing stuff. So a lot of communes sprung up around this. Communes are natural experiments in cooperation without kinship. Of course, communes are where people, this is the love thy neighbor as thyself, in a sort of in an experiment, in a laboratory, as it were, because people band together with a shared ideal and with beyond their kinship, which is what humanity is all about. This is the next step of human evolution, actually. The very appearance of humanity is that, cooperation between individuals without kinship. Anyway, communes, I'm reading from Haidt now, communes can survive only to the extent that they can bind a group together, suppress self-interest, and solve the free rider problem. Communes can survive only to the extent that they can bind the group together, suppress self-interest, and solve the free rider problem. Communes are usually founded by a group of committed believers who reject the moral matrix of the broader society and want to organize themselves along different principles. This is very important for us because can we reject the moral matrix that we bring with us as a baggage from traditions and create a new moral matrix that would be more beneficial and in keeping with our evolutionary progress into a greater caring society? Okay, that was just an aside. I'm continuing with Haidt. For many 19th century communes, the principles were religious. For others, they were secular, mostly socialist. Which kind of commune survived longer? Sosis found that the difference was stark. Just 6% of the secular communes were still functioning 20 years after their founding, compared to 39% of the religious communes. What was the secret ingredient that gave the religious communes a longer shelf life? Sosis quantified everything he could find about life in each commune. He then used these numbers to see if any of them could explain why some stood the test of time while others crumbled. He found one master variable: the number of costly sacrifices that each commune demanded from its members. It was things like giving up alcohol and tobacco, fasting for days at a time, conforming to a communal dress code or hairstyle, or cutting ties with outsiders. For religious communes, the effect was perfectly linear. The more sacrifice a commune demanded, the longer it lasted. But Sosis was surprised to discover that demands for sacrifice did not help secular communes. Most of them failed within 8 years, and there was no correlation between sacrifice and longevity. Why doesn't sacrifice strengthen secular communes? Sosis argues that rituals, laws, and other constraints work best when they are sacralized. He quotes the anthropologist Roy Rappaport: "To invest social conventions with sanctity is to hide their arbitrariness in a cloak of seeming necessity. But when secular organizations demand sacrifice, every member has a right to ask for a cost-benefit analysis, and many refuse to do things that don't make logical sense." Okay, so at this point, we may ask if this is true. And we can see that only if it's a democratic secular community is this appropriate or is this relevant. But once you have a secular community that puts a leader at the top, a Führer, a son of the nations, well, they weren't a democracy, but anyway, but they were secular. So it's not really, if you can put the adulation of a leader there, for example, a leader who says, do not ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, and that leader is much adored, then sacrifice and adhesion, social adhesion, can be organized within the secular sphere. So, in fact, the sacredness that binds together people and height adds irrational beliefs can sometimes help the group function more rationally, particularly when those beliefs rest upon the sanctity foundation. Sacredness binds people together and then bind them to the arbitrariness of the practice. But what is it about sacredness? Sacredness, what does it mean that something is sacred? It means that it's removed from the calculations of this world. You don't ask about it. It's beyond reason, beyond giving justifications. That's what makes something sacred. So actually, sacredness is like closing the ideal from its refutations. It's like saying, if we go back to our little graph here, this encapsulation of the idea, then sanctity, when you sanctify the ideal, then you strip away the fact that all ideals are actually conjectures in the minds of people. And you say, this ideal is divine, that's the way it is, this is absolute truth. You go into sort of Platonian world where you, or Hegelian perhaps, world where you can know the truth, where in fact we only have approximations of the truth. We can only conjecture about the ideal, which could be very good conjectures. Some great Hegelian, Platonian ideas may be fantastic, but only if you take them with a grain of salt, that reality can develop and refute them, evolve them. But what happens when you sanctify something is that it no longer evolves. It sort of petrifies the idea there. This is the ideal, that's sacred. Do not argue with that. And often this kind of idealism is pasted on or merged with a leader. Our alpha male tendency, the tendency to yield to authority. So if you sanctify the authority, you have infallibility of the Pope or the infallibility of the Rebbe Milubavitch, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. All these infallibles of the great religious leaders, they are part of sanctity. So in fact, the leadership and loyalty factor becomes merged with the sanctity factor. In fact, sanctifying something is saying that God made it this way, and this is sacred. You cannot argue against it. So it's like taking the natural development of ideas and petrifying them. But this is very natural. Again, this is part of our pre-wiring, because it's the famous confirmation fallacy. You want to confirm rather than disconfirm. You are not looking for refutations. You are looking for confirmations that your conjectures are truth. And if you can say this is God's own truth, this is the word, you can sanctify your ideal or your idea, then it tends to bind people together because we all agree on this. Nobody's arguing. We have consensus. This is what leads us on. So in this way, you can see how religious organizations take these tendencies that we have to obey, to sanctify, to be loyal, to obey a leader and to obey the sacred rules of our religious order and so on. Haidt shows us how this is based in evolution, and how in fact this becomes the pre-wiring that we are up against when the other strand of evolution, our freedom to grow and develop beyond, to refine our ideas, to look at our ideals, even when they are sacred, and see where the good in them is and where the bad in them is. Because many sacred ideas are great. They help you organize your life and grow and develop, like in 12 steps when you say God will bring us our sanity. So you have the idea of the sacred that's bringing you sanity, and you make a plan to be a better person. But when you have these sacred ideas embedded in various religions, often they come with evolutionary baggage that is problematic in a modern age, that separates so many things that were stuck together, especially gender-wise, where women can be economically independent and they no longer bound by their gender and to their biology, and can pursue their destiny as human beings. Then much of religion becomes problematic because it pulls them back. The ideal, since it was petrified in sanctity, now becomes something that can hold personal development and cultural development back. So in fact, what we need is an ideal of sanctity, a vision of sanctity, a realization that sanctity develops. And this is part of the divine plan. To be always inaccessible to our final cognizance, that we can never know the ultimate truth. It's always beyond us, because the ideal perfection is always beyond human ken. And at the same time, that our various conjectures as they develop, including conjectures regarding sanctity, are part of a divine development of the cosmos, so that we can certainly give sanctity to our realization of where evolution is taking us, and how it is demanding from us or encouraging us to develop our empathy and our sensitivity, our goodness, to become more perfect in so many ways. So, in fact, through Evotrust, through belief in the real, in the revelation of the divine, that is unfolding within reality, within ourselves, in reality, within human civilization, we can bring back an affirming sense of sanctity without losing our freedom to continue growing. But what we are up against is exactly that sacrifice, that self-sacrifice that we bring with us as part of our evolutionary pre-wiring, that created within us the ability to subjugate ourselves, to take a step back and assume a place of humbleness and modesty in face of what we believe is our greater ideals, the greater good, the ideal as the good, however we perceive it, and our ability to self-efface in front of these ideas, to sacrifice ourselves for them. And this is a very strong two-way street, because the more you sacrifice, the more you are engaged with the greater whole. The more you give to society, the more you feel engaged with that society, the more you want the benefit of it, the more the good of the many becomes your good, becomes something very important to you, because you have done so much to promote it. You have given so much for the success of your society, for your civilization. Again, when you don't ask what your society can do for you, but what you can do for society, you become idealistic. You have greater power and motivation to do so many things. So if we go back to Haidt and continue to view what he writes about the evolution of religion, then we can see how, in fact, inverts our usual idea of religion and makes it something that grows out of evolution, that evolves. And in fact, now that we are viewing all this through the lens of Evotrust, we kind of invert the classic ideas that developed in the 19th century about man creating God in man's own image. And we're saying, yes, indeed, man does that, but man himself, herself, is created in God's image in the sense that people embody the growth and perfectibility of divinity itself. So it's like God created man to create God in an ever growing approximation of the actual perfection of God. Anyway, what we take from Haidt here is that religion has been beneficial for human beings in preserving their cohesion as groups. So I'm reading now from page 157 from Haidt. He writes, in his book Darwin's Cathedral, Wilson catalogues the ways that religions have helped groups cohere, divide labor, work together, and prosper. He shows how John Calvin developed a strict and demanding form of Christianity that suppressed free riding and facilitated trust and commerce in 16th century Geneva. Because if you have a God, then you trust others to believe in that God, then you are not going to cheat each other. He shows how medieval Judaism created cultural fortresses that kept outsiders out and insiders in. Indeed, Judaism is famous for its survivability as a group through its deep beliefs. One of the main classic utterances in Judaism is every generation our enemies gather round to exterminate us, and God saves us from them. This very belief of us against the world against us, and the belief that God will save us by adhering to God, by becoming a group that completely organized its lifestyle according to its ideals about God and what God requires of the Jewish nation. The Jewish nation, in fact, survived throughout history in a most, in quite amazing way, and there's been a lot written about that. But I'll be discussing unique aspects of Judaism in another talk in a future. But in any case, as part of our vision of evolution, it is obvious that evolving a kind of faith that helps people cohere assists in the survival of the group almost in face of anything. And the Jewish people are a testimony to the great power of faith in preserving a nation over thousands of years of persecution, dispersion, whatever. It's like an ark over the waters of history. Really an amazing phenomenon. And we see how indeed faith, belief in God, and the cohesion that it creates, and that we all share the same belief, actually stabilizes society. I'm continuing now with Jonathan Haidt. On page 158, he writes, he quotes from The Faith Instinct by Nicholas Wade, who reviews what is known about prehistoric religious practices and strongly endorses Wilson's theory of religion, i.e. that it is part of group selection. He notes that it's hard to tell an evolutionary story in which these ancient practices conferred an advantage on individuals as they competed with their less religious neighbors in the same group. Religion for individuals, like isolated holy persons, do not carry group advantages for the group. But it's obvious that these practices help groups to compete with other groups. This is also true even if the religion is otherworldly, like in Buddhism, for example, okay? So all the people, the laity, this whole thing of laity and priesthoods, I'll go into it in another talk, so I'll not diverge at the moment. Anyway, reading on, in Haidt, he writes on page 158 that people belonging to a religiously cohesive society are more likely to survive and reproduce than those in less cohesive groups who may be vanquished by their enemies or dissolved in discord. In the population as a whole, genes that promote religious behavior are likely to become more common in each generation as the less cohesive societies perish and the more united ones thrive. Of course, since religion itself is constantly undergoing evolution, it remains open-ended what exactly is religious behavior. But it certainly has these ideas of sanctity and the solidification of a theory, of an ideal as dogma that everyone upholds. And this belief makes it possible to trust one another on the one hand. On the other hand, it gives rise to persecution of those outside the group, or at least alienation from them. God and religions, writes Haidt on page 158, in sum, are group-level adaptations for producing cohesiveness and trust. They are created by members of the group and they organize and then organize the activity of the group. But if we take this to a theological level, then the groups themselves, the very appearance of evolution, is a divine thing. It's something that happens within God. So it's like Matrushka dolls, one within the other. God creates humanity, who create groups and then organize the activity of the group through reference to a God that constantly evolves so that we have a deeper and more comprehensive idea of what the divine really is. And this also is not static, it's developing as we learn more about reality and as reality itself updates our vision of God. Your God is not the same before we realized how small we are in an almost infinite cosmos, an awe-inspiring cosmos. This is the real. So the real inspires a vision of God as infinite that could not be had before we had this vision of reality. In the same way, the present talks show how our vision of evolution, what we know now about the way life developed, also influences how we are able to interpret the divine and God. So we have a different God now that we realize how divine reality is, how awesome reality is. And the more we know from a scientific point of view, the more we update our theological vision of God. Okay, going back to Haidt, in regard to the usefulness of religion and belief in God for humanity as a piece of, as a force of cohesion. On page 177 he writes, social cohesion is a necessity, and mankind has never yet succeeded in enforcing cohesion by merely rational arguments. Every community is exposed to two opposite dangers: ossification through too much discipline and reverence to tradition on the one hand. This is the classic traditional problem that we have, but it also evolved. Why did Christianity have all those schisms? Because reality keeps pushing against tradition itself, so new traditions are born. But still, such ossification gives rise to new traditions, and then these reflect on the old ones. For example, the evolution of Catholicism in view of Protestantism, and so on. On the other hand, we face another problem, and this is the modern problem, the solution or subjection to foreign conquest through the growth of individualism and personal independence that makes cooperation possible. I'm not sure that individual leads to subjection to foreign conquest. I don't know where he got that, but certainly we have this problem of dissolution in modern societies, and we'll discuss it at greater length in future talks. I continue with Haidt. On page 164, he writes, "If you think about religion as a set of beliefs about supernatural agents, you're bound to misunderstand it. You'll see those beliefs as foolish delusions, perhaps even as parasites that exploit our brains for their own benefit. But if you take a Durkheimian approach to religion, focusing on belonging, and a Darwinian approach to morality involving multi-level selection, you get a very different picture. You see that religious practices have been binding our ancestors into groups for tens of thousands of years. That binding usually involves some blinding. Once any person, book, or principle is declared sacred, then devotees can no longer question it or think clearly about it. Our ability to believe in supernatural agents may well have begun as an accidental byproduct of a hypersensitive agency detection device. Of course, we don't think it began as an accident. We think that it's part of the divine aspect of evolution. In any way, but once early humans began believing in such agents, the groups that used them to construct moral communities were the ones that lasted and prospered. Like those 19th century religious communes, they used their gods to elicit sacrifice and commitment from members. Like those subject in the cheating studies and trust games, their gods helped them to suppress cheating and increase trustworthiness. Only groups that can elicit commitment and suppress free riding can grow. So, to sum up what we take here from Haidt, we see that in fact he places evolution from his point of view, and it's a quite materialistic perspective. It's a perspective that is more in harmony with the neo-Darwinists, the new atheists that rise from neo-Darwinism, and less from the way that we view evolution. But certainly he points to the way that we see how things developed from a descriptive point of view, even though from an interpretive point of view, we take another view of matters. So let's sum up what we learned from Haidt from our theological perspective. So since evolution itself, the cosmos itself, is the evolving aspect of the divine that arises from the lowest possible point, a point of ultimate condensity in which everything was potential and nothing was actual, i.e. the Big Bang. And since then, over 14 billion years, the world has been slowly developing, and we see through the trend of evolution, the thrust of evolution, that what is developing is greater mindfulness, greater care for others, in fact, the very appearance of the other. So obviously, the appearance of religion and the evolution of religion is not something that is outside the context of this development. So in fact, religion, the evolution of religion and of belief in the divine is part of our ability to perceive, to represent others in our minds. We all believe in a certain God or in a certain cosmic laws that manage reality, that go through reality. And this helps group cohesion. and eventually groups that have stronger beliefs evolve in a way that makes them take precedence in reality over groups that have beliefs that are less cohesive. In particular, we have seen throughout the world how beliefs in separate gods, idolatry beliefs that are less moralistic, were replaced by monotheistic beliefs, either through conquest or through conversion and conviction. So this is very interesting, the way that this goes. We will have a lot to say about this later when we look at missionary work, both Christian and Muslim. How and why do idolatry nations, idolatry people relinquish their gods for the one God? Usually the idea of a powerful God is already embedded within idolatry. There is a Zeus, a Jupiter, a Shiva in every religion. And so it seems quite simple to take the leap to go to a one monotheistic, monistic God. But this also has its problems, as we know, and we will discuss these in future talks, and show how, in fact, this idea of Evotrust sublimates the monotheistic idea and unites it with actually pagan ideas about the world, because in fact, we see the world as part of the divine, but it is the eternal divine. The same mono divine is, in fact, incorporates all the plurality and all the appearances of the world itself. So it's like a pan-emanationism that incorporates ideas of pantheism and panentheism that preceded this vision of divinity historically and philosophically. And our vision, in fact, this ideal or conjecture ideal of Evotrust, in fact, unifies some of the lines, the threads of religious development that we saw over history. But to sum up, we can take whatever we learn from Haidt and blend it, merge it into our theological vision, because we do not disengage the ideas that people have in their minds from reality. So the reality of evolution that gave rise to group cohesion, that gave rise to group cohesion within mind, because as we saw, the only way for a group to cohere is through mindfulness, through representations of others in our minds, through inter-subjectivity. And there, the idea of the divine tallied very well with the previous rungs of evolution, where we had an alpha male, we had a strong male looking out for us, but also oppressing us, requiring our obedience and allegiance and so on. So we can see how man invented God, but as the idea of the divinity evolves, we also see how this helps reciprocally for society to expand and grow morally, until we are at this point of time that we again are at a crossroads of evolution. And of course, our ideal of the divine has to be updated for what is truly happening. And I certainly hope, I believe that the ideas of Evotrust, this belief in the real that has been going on and growing and developing over the last few hundred years since the rise of science, provides a new synthesis, a new paradigm for looking at both evolution, human progress, and the divine. Okay, so Wrapping up, we'll be summarizing Hyde finally in our next talk, and we will be moving on to other aspects and implications of believing the real. So see you in the next talks.